Hi, everybody. It's me again. Um, we're all done with the second section of the class. You did your second exam, and the class as a whole did very, very well. I'm not going to go over the exam question by question because I figured out how to allow you to see the correct answers to the ones that you got wrong, so you can understand your grade that was posted on Brightspace. If there's any questions, give me an email and I can explain something. But I think it's pretty straightforward, given that it was all multiple choice. So we're going to start on the last unit of the class on adulthood and aging. And we're going to start off in this lecture talking about a new stage of development called emerging adulthood. And I'm going to attempt to share my screen here. Let's see if that works. Now, you can just actually, yeah, let's do it this. I'm sharing my screen. I don't know if you can see the thumbnail of me. Maybe what I'll do here is what I'm going to suggest. I posted this PowerPoint on emerging adulthood on Brightspace. So maybe what you can do is when you watch the video, also watch the PowerPoint and go through the PowerPoint. This way, I can just talk with you without dividing the screen. Okay, so anyway, I'm going to talk about emerging adulthood, which is the newest stage of the lifespan. And you remember when we ended talking about adolescence, I kept saying to you that while we know when adolescence begins, that is at age 13, where there's a qualitative shift in the physical motor stage of development, specifically that is part of the puberty sequence, that we reach reproductive potential at approximately 13 years of age. So that's a qualitative, significant shift in the human lifespan, and it heralds a new stage of adolescence. The problem is, when does adolescence, end, and when does adulthood, early adulthood, begin? In the past, it's been at when you get to 18 and you have, all of a sudden you're an adult. So you can, and what's the justification for that? Well, the justification is you get certain legal privileges at 18. You get the privilege to vote, you get the privilege to own property, you get the privilege to marry without parental consent, you get the ability to fight in a war. There are many social privileges that accrue. About the only thing you can't do at 18 is you can't drink in some states that require 21, and I don't believe you can rent a car until you're 25. But anyway, for the most part, you're in a legal sense an adult. You can be tried as an adult in a court of law. But really, are people adults at that point, even though that they have these legal prerogatives? So some people would say to end at 20 or 21, but it's also arbitrary. And it's been the naughtiest problem in the developmental narrative that I presented to you, at the beginning of class. Well, in recent years, I think that the field has solved that problem. At least there's a growing consensus that they have. And the way they've solved the problem is to insert a stage of development in between adolescence and early adulthood. So that stage is called emerging adulthood. And that was a term that was coined by a psychologist by the name of Jeffrey Arnett. And now I'm actually going to share the screen, with you. Um, oops. Yeah, there it is. So now Jeffrey Arnett, as the screen says, is a developmental psychologist and studies adolescents. When he was first working, I think he was at Clark University in Massachusetts, which was the same college that G. Stanley Hall, remember G. Stanley Hall from the storm and stress model of adolescence? He was also at Clark University. So it's really interesting that that tiny school on the East Coast has two prominent theorists in the area, of adolescence. Anyway, so for Arnett, what he proposed is that we insert a new stage of life between 18, the end of adolescence, and 26. Now, in that time period between 18 and 26, here are the things that are the characteristics of emerging adulthood. Tell me if this makes sense to you, because you're, for the first time, the expert at this, because this is an attempt to conceptualize aspects of your own development. I think most people in the class are within 18 and 26 years of age. Actually 25, 26 you would be early adulthood. But I think most people are in that stage, except for me, who's just barely older than that. Anyway, tell me if this rings true to you. So in this stage of development that you're more independent than of your parents than you were as a teenager. Now, you may even have moved out of the family home. You may have been living, this is pre-coronavirus, of course. You may have been living in the dorm or in an apartment or sharing a house somewhere, or frat house or sorority or whatever. But you may have moved out of the family home. The economic circumstances, and here I'm talking about contextual development, may have impacted this in that some people are staying in their family homes, even in college, in order to save money because college is so expensive now. But anyway, still, I think the point holds that there are more people between 18 and 25 that have moved out of the family home and are more independent of their parents than adolescents. Even the ones who have stayed in their parents' home may operate differently with greater autonomy and independence than when they were a teenager. The second one is that even though you're more independent of your parents than you were as a teenager, you still not entered into the commitments that characterize and define typical adult life. Like when you think of somebody who's a quote unquote full-fledged adult, you think that they have a long-term job or a career, that they may be married, although fewer people are getting married, and they're getting married later, and that there may even have become parents and have a child or children. These are the kinds of stable, enduring commitments you think about of most people, not all people, but most people who are well into adulthood. So you have this interval of time when you're more independent of your parents, but you haven't quite entered into these commitments that define adulthood. And so what do you do during this transitional period? Well, what you do is you experiment. You try out all kinds of things. You try different ways of living. You could try different work options, different volunteer options, different relationships, experiment with aspects of personal identity. All kinds of things are open to experiment and experience. And because of this experimental quality of this interim between adolescence and full adulthood, Arnett characterized it as an age of exploration, instability, possibility, and self-focus. So you are really more oriented to yourself and trying things, and you can move around and you live here and you try this. And then after it's over, then people begin to settle down into a stable set of economic and social responsibilities. So there it is. Does that make sense to you? Does that capture your life compared to somebody who might be in their late 20s or 30s and when you were a teenager? Well, that's what you need to think about. Now, if you agree with that, and I think most people in the field, do agree with that, then you have to change the narrative of the human lifespan, okay, that we showed at the beginning. And if you look at this, the change in the model, everything stays the same through adolescence, okay? So you start off with this age, conception and birth, and that's what we call prenatal. And then you're born and till 2.5, infancy and toddlerhood, then early childhood, middle childhood, and adolescence. So everything's the same up through here. But then we have this period of time between 18 and 40, which used to be early adulthood. Okay? But now, and then you go 40 to 60, you go middle adulthood. But now instead of doing it that traditional way, we're breaking the period of 18 to 40 into two stages. 18 to 26 is emerging adulthood, 26 to 40 is early adulthood, okay? And then after 40, then everything goes back to the original one. 40 to 60 is middle adulthood, 60 to 80, late adulthood, 80 and beyond, late adulthood, and the last 12 months, death and dying, okay? So the only question that is being posed, because I think there is a consensus that this system on the right, where we have two stages between 18 and 40, there's one other possibility that's being considered. And that is, instead of carving out right here 7 years, 18 to 25, 18 through 25, 18 to 26, instead of carving out these 7 years from early adulthood to create room for this stage, emerging adulthood, and that takes those 7 years out of early adulthood and makes early adulthood a much shorter stage, 26 to 40, only 14 years. Whereas the other stages of development, middle adulthood, late adulthood, and possibly late adulthood, are come in at 2-decade intervals. So some people have proposed that what we do is we insert emerging adulthood, 18 to 25, and then make early adulthood 25 to 45, middle adulthood 45 to 60, late adulthood 65 to 80, and late adulthood, 85 and beyond, with the last 12 months death and dying. So that all the phases of adult development retain their 2-decade character. We don't lose that. Anyway, it's an interesting idea. Carve it out from early adulthood, but then push middle adulthood by 5 years to keep all the stages of adulthood as 20-year cycles up through late adulthood. I kind of like that, but that has not been decided yet, and so we'll see what happens with that nuance. All right, now before going into the supporting research for emerging adulthood, I just want to let you know that these ideas and have been kicked around for quite some time. People have known that the transition from adolescence to early adulthood, was really the most confusing and complicated social transition in development. Remember, I told you that in cognitive development, the biggest transition was from infancy and toddlerhood to early childhood, when we go to become symbolic creatures, that is like the Grand Canyon of mental development. There's nothing else comparable to it, in life. Well, I think that this transition from the end of adolescence to the beginning of early adulthood and how to handle that is the most complicated social change in the human lifespan. And people have been grappling with this a long time. And as a reflection of that long consideration of this transition, there have been a lot of words and terms and concepts that have buzzed around the culture. And I just collected some of them here. Late adolescence, extended adolescence, transition to adulthood, young adulthood, youth, identity moratorium that you studied about when you read about Marcia's work. You don't need to know the definitions of each one of them. I just want you to understand that this didn't come out of the blue, that people have been talking about stuff like this and trying to figure it out for a long time. And this is reflected in the language of the culture and these terms. Now you can ask yourself, why emerging adulthood and Arnett's work stuck when for a long time people have been considering this? And I think it's because that Arnett, as a social psychologist, provided data to support his concept, and talked in very great detail about changes that were happening in culture that support this notion of emerging adulthood. And as I said, he also provided data to back up his thinking. So it wasn't just a loose idea. It was a very well thought out and supported concept. So let's turn our attention to the data that Arnett presents to justify this new stage. And again, it's become persuasive and integrated into the narrative. All right, so the first thing that he points to is that to support the idea that there should be this new stage toward emerging adulthood, is that two of the main markers of full adult status, which is marriage and parenthood, have been occurring later and later in development. And check out this chart here. Now, this is just for the second half of the 20th century, 1960 to the jumps from 1960 to 2000. But the trends that are depicted here have continued over the last 2 decades too. So anyway, ignore this thing, 3D column 3, I didn't include that. So just we have 2 columns, which is the median age of parenthood for men and the median age of parenthood for women. Now, men are always a little bit later than women. They get married. They've always gotten married about a year or 2 older. Their median age has been a year or 2 older than women. So you can see in 1960, the median age for marriage for a woman was 20 years old in 1960. Now, the median is not the same as the average. The median is that the number whereby half of the people are above that number and half of the people are below that number. So half of the women who got married in 1960 were below 20, half of the women were above 20, okay? And for the men, it was about 22, 23 years of age. Then it started to creep up a few months, in 1970. And then starting 1980, it went up more, big jump in the 90s, and another jump in 2020. And right now, it's continuing to rise. And the median, I believe, for men is 28. Again, not the average, but the median for men, and the median for women, I think, is 27, something like that. Okay. Now, I put a note here that parenthood, I didn't put another chart for parenthood because there's a very simple mathematical equation to compute the median age of parenthood using the median age of marriage. And that is, you just add 1. It's very complex. I know you're not math majors, but you can do that. So if the median age today for getting married for a woman is 28, then the median age for having their first child is 29. I will allow you to fill in the gaps on the dynamics of that. Okay. So you see that we're delaying one of the markers, 2 of the markers of full adult status or typical full adult status. Now, not that everyone gets married and has children, but the large majority do at some point. And that marker has been moving up. So this isn't just theory, this is an empirical fact, okay? Now the question is, why are people getting married and having children later, okay? And this is, now we're going to move toward contextual analysis. We're going to look at, because there's no universal reason why people, get married and have parents, become parents at any particular time. These are affected by the culture. And so this rise in the age of marriage and parenthood, a lot of social psychologists and sociologists have pointed to these factors. One is that we have freely available contraception and more open attitudes about premarital sexuality. Obviously, if you don't have freely available, inexpensive contraception, there are going to be more inadvertent pregnancies. And this might lead to a more early marriages. And also, to the extent that the society has very strong prohibitions against premarital sexuality, that those individuals who were, wanted to begin their sexual life either had to violate these social prohibitions, or they could choose to get married earlier so that they could begin their sexual life. A second reason is that we have smaller families now. The average number of children now in the United States is about 1.7. So for people who have the average number of children per woman of childbearing age, okay, is 1.7, whereas 200 years ago it was probably 7 children, and in the mid 20th century, let's say 1950s, it was 3.5 children. So it's been reduced by half. Okay, so we're having smaller families, and if you couple that with the fact that we're living longer, many of us are living into our 80s, 90s, 100, and so you can, if you can have a small family and you're living later, you could start later. There's no need to rush. So those kinds of factors are affecting delayed parenthood. And finally, another reason for delay is changes in the job or labor market. In particular, one is that more and more women are in the workforce, and they have other things that they're doing other than getting married and having children. They have other aspects of their life which oftentimes will delay marriage. It's like they have multiple roles that fill up their life, and it's not just as soon as you can get married and have children, that is your role. In fact, now for the first time, we have more than half of the adult labor force in the United States are female workers. I think it's 52% to 48%, something along those lines, because the jobs of the 21st century don't require physical strength to the level it did in the industrial age, when there was some benefit to the larger size and level of strength of male workers. But now that it's more about interpersonal skills and social skills, emotional skills, there are many times which are really, not always, but can be superior for women, that there are more job opportunities for women in the labor force, and that may delay marriage and parenting. Another thing, which is a complex one, is that we have fewer manufacturing jobs. Now, why is that important? Well, in the heyday of the industrial age, before the computer age, a lot of good jobs were in manufacturing. People were producing goods in assembly plants and cars and consumer products and things of that nature. And you didn't require you didn't require a college education to get these jobs, and these jobs paid enough to support a middle-class life. You can go to high school, get a job at US Steel or General Electric or General Motors or Xerox or all these big manufacturing companies, the Amazons and Facebook and Googles of their time. And they would hire you right out of high school. Sometimes generation after generation of kids and communities would be hired. work where their father worked, etc. And they would get paid really good wages for the time, like $27 an hour, which, 50 years ago, that was enough to have a middle-class life in rural America. You could buy a house, buy a little house, get married, have some room for your kids, send your kids to public school, and you can make it on that. Nowadays, as more and more robotics and artificial intelligence are running manufacturing, and the jobs require, college educations for the most part, there are very, very few jobs that you can go right out of high school and make a living wage. There are some, electricians, plumbers, those kinds of specialty trades. You can probably do it, but there are not as many as there used to be. So people are delayed about getting the money and getting in a situation that they can even afford having children. In our next unit on early adulthood, I'm going to have you do an engaged learning assignment. I don't know if we'll do it or just talk about it, about financing a family and financing children. Could be interesting. Then the last one is because of what we're doing here. I said the jobs require, higher education and more sophisticated credentialing. And so people spend more time, finishing their education. And so they put off, being able to be in the workforce, having the money, and getting married and starting a family. So these are all the reasons to justify this chart here, okay? That's what's going on here. Now, there are some other sources of evidence that Arnett collected that are also very, very interesting. The next chart is very interesting psychologically. It's the time individuals perceive that they're adults. And you can see here on this chart, so there are four age groups. The first chart, 12 to 17 right here, okay? These are kids who are pre-adolescents and adolescents, okay? Then we have the stage of what would make up emerging adulthood. Then we have 26 to 35, which is the first part of early adulthood. And then 36 to 55, which would be the transition into middle adulthood and the large majority of middle adulthood. So he set up these four different groupings. And he asked people in each of these age groups, I don't know the exact end, but it was a large end because it was a very simple study. He simply asked them, do you feel like an adult? Okay. Now, of course, in any kind of self-report, there can be social desirability, which will add bias to this to some degree. But with that caveat in mind, there's some pretty strong evidence here. The number of people who are adolescents and pre-adolescents who said that they feel like an adult is about 17%, okay? That's very odd. I mean, there may be some very young people who've gone through some hard times. Maybe they were in a single parent family and had to be quasi a member of the executive unit of the family, almost like an adult. Maybe they were parentified by the adult that they were with, or maybe the child was just grandiose. I don't know what the reasons were, but there were a fairly small but notable number of people who, even before 18, before the end of adolescence, say they feel like an adult. Then, in the period of 18 to 25, the period of emerging adulthood, we see that about 38% of individuals say they feel like an adult. All right? So that's a minority of people. How can you call that adulthood when the majority of the people in the stage of adulthood don't feel like adults? That's crazy. It makes no sense. Because what we're trying to do is to have a narrative of the lifespan that captures people's lives. So how can we have a narrative of the lifespan which says that you're an adult in these ages when in fact a distinct minority of people in that phase call themselves an adult? Crazy. So that's powerful evidence there. And in fact, it's not until age 26 and the period of age 26 and 35, which is now the majority of the time that is considered in the new narrative, early adulthood. For the first time in development, people feel like adults. They perceive themselves that they're in adulthood. And now you have 67%, 2/3, who consider themselves adults. Now that makes more sense to me, that if you have a stage of adulthood, that you have the majority of people who actually feel that they're adults. And then later on, it gets, in the next phase, over 90% of people feel that they are adults. So to me, this chart is a compelling argument to say that we need to hold off saying that people are fully in adulthood, because we don't want full adulthood to start when the majority of people don't feel that way. The last piece of evidence that that Arnett presented is rates of moving by age. Now, this is a tough one, because remember that part of the definition back here, let me go back and show you. Remember here, part of the definition is that people use this interval of time between the dominance by the family of origin and the new web of adult obligations to try out new ways of living and different options for love, relationship, work, and personal identity. Therefore, it's an age of exploration and instability. All right? So Arnett was like left with the social scientist dilemma, which is, okay, we got this great theoretical system. It kind of makes sense, but how do we test this empirically? How do we generate data that can support our conclusions or not? So how does one support that this is a stage of instability and exploration? Okay, you could ask people, do you feel like you're exploring? And there are different ways of doing it, but one really objective measure for how unstable and in transition and moving and experimenting and reconfiguring one's life is how often people at that age are moving. Because every time you move, there's a different, you're moving in a relationship, you're moving out of a relationship, you're moving in with friends, you're graduating, you're taking a new job. It's a good indirect measure of the stability and fluidity versus fluidity of an age, of a generation. So if we look at this chart here, we see, again, that from 10 to 14, and then here 15 through 19, the periods, before and just up to the beginning of emerging adulthood, that a very low rate of people move from year to year. So this is basically before college, before emerging adulthood. You have maybe 15% of young people between 10 and, through 19, who are moving. That's not very high, okay? But look what happens when you get into emerging adulthood. You have 35% of people between the ages of 20 and 24 in surveys will tell you that they moved in the preceding year. That's an incredible amount of motion and fluidity. And then it starts out of emerging adulthood. Once you get into adulthood progressively and you move into middle adulthood and further, look at the decline. So this supports the notion that the core of emerging adulthood is one of the most fluid, unstable, shifting, exploratory kinds of times in the human lifespan, and supports the notion that Jeffrey Arnett put forth. Okay? Now, before I end, I want to mention how Arnett's notion of emerging adulthood has affected your lives, not just by maybe making this make sense a little bit more. You could say, well, I'm not a teenager, I'm not an adolescent anymore, I'm not an adult, I'm an emerging adult. I mean, it really fits and adds some coherence, to life, rather than feeling, am I an adult, am I a teenager, who am I? It gives you an identity that makes sense. But there's a practical way that it's probably had an impact in many of your lives, which is that in the Affordable Care Act, sometimes called Obamacare, which is this major revision of the healthcare system that's still debated and attacked, and people are trying to change it or destroy it or solidify it. It's in the middle of our political grinder. But anyway, it still exists. It's existed for quite some time. And one of the key provisions of the Affordable Health Care Act is that the offspring of parents can remain on the parents' health care policies until the age of 26. Now, that's not a coincidence. It's based upon the application of brain science, as we've talked about before, and also these developmental systems. You remember the brain science, which said that the brain is not fully developed. The frontal cortex does not complete its development until the mid-20s, around 26. So if your brain isn't fully developed, then you're not fully developed. And if you're not fully developed, then you're still could be considered acceptably dependent on your parents, and you should be able to stay on their healthcare policy. But the other contribution to support you staying on your parents' healthcare policy, if they have one, is this. That is, you're not fully an adult. You're considered an emerging adult. You're not fully an adult by developmental standards, and therefore you should be able to remain on your parents' policy. So you see that very important aspects of public policy are determined to some frequently by the use of data from psychology, from neuroscience, and in this case, developmental psychology. So it has an important applied significance. All right, I'm going to end there. I'm going to now upload the video to a YouTube channel, create a link, and I'll put the link onto Brightspace a little bit later so you can refer to this. All right, you guys, take care. And the next lecture that I'll post and set of slides will be next week on adulthood, early adulthood. All right, take care. Bye-bye.